Probiotics and prebiotics together may not have the zonulin modulating effects as optimal as probiotics by themselves. So you got to keep that in mind. I typically always add in probiotics after we've removed a lot of the dysbiotic bacteria. As some of the studies showed, a lot of this dysbiosis, and that can happen from processed food, indigestion, can happen from antibiotic exposure, but different dysbiosis can drive gut permeability. While at the same time, once we've cleaned some of that out, that's going to have its own effect of reducing gut permeability. We add in probiotics shown to have a modulatory effect of bringing down that zonulin. And if you look at some of the studies that were out there, there was a doctor over at Harvard University, Alessio Fasano. He was one of the big studiers of gluten, and he was back in an Italian university in the mid 2000s. He went over to Harvard. His big kind of claim to fame is looking at zonulin and its impact, and gluten being the biggest driver of it. But he was looking more for a medication to reduce zonulin. My issue with medications is if it doesn't address the root underlying cause, it's going to tend to have side effects. That's the problem with it. It's like the Vioxx of 2003 when they were trying to block the COX enzyme, cyclooxygenase enzyme. Well, the problem with it was, yeah, it helped reduce inflammation, but that enzyme was also very important for the gut lining and the heart to repair. So when you block that inflammation from that enzyme, you had some good inflammation reduction effects, but then you also increased chance of strokes and heart attacks and other gut issues because that enzyme was so important to building up that tissue. And so you got to be careful because if the root cause is up here and you're managing downstream effects, inherently you're going to have side effects. Right? Same thing with the HMG-CoA reductase enzyme. That's the enzyme that statins work on. Well, you block that enzyme, okay, but the mevalonic acid pathway is downstream that produces CoQ10. So very important, right? Because that's really an important mitochondrial building block and nutrient to run the Krebs cycle and to run electron transport chain to produce ATP. So very important. So if we go back here, right, we have talked about probiotics. Probiotics are going to have modulatory reducing effects of reducing that zonulin protein. Prebiotics as well. Some studies will show probiotics more. Some studies will show prebiotics with probiotics less. Again, I always recommend adding things in one at a time. Some people will get bloaty and gassy when they add in prebiotics. And if that's the case, I always recommend go slow, but add probiotics in first and do it after you've done kind of a kill phase. So you've kind of cleared out the landscape and you have a much better chance of being probiotic intolerance. If you're just coming in and dropping a whole bunch of probiotics and you haven't fixed digestion, you haven't fixed food allergens, you haven't addressed any of the inflammation in the gut, you're more than likely to have problems. Stress is a big one, all right? I see that quite frequently. There's studies on runners, for instance, going out for a long marathon run training session and testing gut permeability and seeing an increase in gut permeability. And why is that? Because of the stress hormone cortisol breaks down proteins. Well, the tight junctions are proteins, right? It's protein-based, protein-driven. That helps keep that gut intact. And so the more catabolic you get, whether it's from excess emotional stress or excess physical stress, you have a greater chance of cortisol, which is incredibly catabolic, to break down that gut lining and increase gut permeability.